Even though Sidious was gone, Anakin was still fighting for his life. It was just a different sort of fight now. In this moment, his sole desire was for one full breath of air. Just one. The lightsaber blow had obviously damaged the muscles it had hit, making the smallest movements difficult. It was not worth it to attempt to take a deep breath. He tried not to look at the wound itself, but he soon found himself staring at it. It looked just like how his arm had looked after Count Dooku had cut it off, red and black and blistering. Even though Sidious's lightsaber was gone, the fiery sensation remained. Anakin thought of Obi-Wan's description of Qui-Gon's death, which had been swift and brutal. The former Jedi Master had been completely run through with a lightsaber, leaving him with a few short minutes to live. Anakin figured he had more time than Qui-Gon did. But he wondered if it would be easier to just stop trying. Every breath was a conscious effort, all he had to do was stop thinking about it, and all this would be over. His life had been full of loss and failure and emptiness. Maybe dying wouldn't be so bad. But in his mind, he could just see Leia, as if she was actually there. She was huddled up in a corner, holding her knees to her chest, trembling and looking fearfully around. Her hair and clothes were disheveled, and her face was pale. Maybe she thought the rest of her life would be like this, and, even worse, maybe she was right. Did she think that Anakin had abandoned her, forgotten her? If only she knew how hard he had tried. With these thoughts fresh in his mind, he decided that he couldn't passively accept this fate while she was suffering. If he didn't at least try to fight his way out of this, any chance of bringing her back to Padme and Luke would be gone forever. He forced himself to sit up, even though that was probably the most painful thing he could possibly do right now. Anyone else might have been rendered unconscious. But it was over after a few intense seconds, and standing up fully was easier from there. Anakin's lightsaber was on the floor nearby, so he used the Force to retrieve it. Why had Sidious not taken it or destroyed it? The first thing any lightsaber user learned was to always take their disarmed opponent's weapon. That was basic common sense. He was in no mood to try to figure out Sidious and his complicated motivations, so he kept going. He had no choice but to walk slowly and lean against a wall. How in the world was he supposed to do complicated things, like figuring out Leia's location in this labyrinth and fight the people who were holding her captive? All that was already hard, if not impossible, without a debilitating injury. Only one thing could help him now. The Force. But he couldn't concentrate. He couldn't erase all the thoughts and feelings from his mind in order to tap into the peace and calmness of the Force. Maybe, he thought, that's not the only way to access the Force. Of course it wasn't. He had always known that, but never actually thought about it much. Never dared to try it. In that moment, he gave up on trying to hold everything back. He let himself focus on his fear of losing Leia, his anger at fate, and his burning desire to see Padme and Luke again. This line of thinking completely transformed the nature of the Force that surrounded him. In fact, it was exactly what he had been trained to avoid, but he didn't care. It was working. It felt like a fresh boost of adrenaline, giving him the power and motivation to hurry up the stairs and get back into the Imperial Academy. It wasn't that the Force had taken all the pain away, it just gave him the ability to fight through it. Anakin had little to no idea where he was going, once again. But there was a definite disturbance in the Force, which he followed, hoping it would actually lead to Leia this time, and not to Sidious. He found himself heading down a long, windowless, dark gray hallway. Perfectly symmetrical from all angles, and seeming to have no end, it was a surreal sort of place. But eventually he came to the end, where two stormtroopers stood guarding an entrance. They drew their blasters as Anakin approached, but he activated his lightsaber and ran them both through before they even had a chance to shoot. Their armored bodies fell to the ground with a loud thump. Anakin barely noticed. The doors opened up to another long hallway, but this one had several stormtroopers and Imperial officers guarding a series of doors. Seeing their peers' lifeless bodies on the floor, they all drew their blasters and open-fired. There were about 10 of them. As laser blasts flew in all directions, the Force guided Anakin's movements into blocking them precisely. Most of the blasts flew right back at their original source. A few more stormtroopers fell. One of them ran for the control panel to signal for help. Anakin stabbed him in the chest without hesitation. The remaining troops tried to escape through the door, but Anakin forced it closed. As he finished off the remaining troops, he didn't once consider whether or not he could have spared them. This was the will of the Force. This was what he had to do to get Leia back. He didn't realize it, but if he had been able to see his reflection, he would have been able to see that his eyes had turned yellow. The room was completely silent now, except for the quiet humming of Anakin's lightsaber. He deactivated it and walked numbly up to the control panel to open the last door. Leia was close. He knew it. One of the Imperial officers had fallen on top of the control panel. His eyes were open, and there was a deep burn from a laser blast on his chest. An expression of horror was permanently frozen on his face. Anakin hesitated before moving the body aside. It was a sickening feeling to look around at all the bodies and to realize that they had all died by the lightsaber in his hand. A terrifying thought suddenly entered his mind. Do I even deserve to rescue Leia now? Is it fair for her to be raised by a murderer? But he hadn't really murdered those people, had he? They had chosen to serve and defend the Empire. They weren't innocent. On the other hand, he couldn't really say he had killed them purely out of self-defense. They were the ones who had to defend themselves. There was one solution in Anakin's mind. Leia must never know about this. The dark side had left him now, and he wasn't sure if he wanted it back. It was impossible to control this amount of power. Hopefully, he wouldn't feel this desperate ever again. This would be the last time he used it. He found the button to open the last door, which led to a small hallway. There were only 3 doors in there, and Leia's presence in the Force radiated out of the middle one. Anakin opened it without hesitation. And there was Leia. Strapped to a cold metal chair in this windowless, dimly lit cell, she gave a faint cry of surprise when the door hissed open. She was visibly shaking, and there was a swollen purple bruise on her cheek. But her eyes brightened when she recognized Anakin. "Daddy." "Leia, it's okay, you're going to be okay." Anakin tried to smile at her and knelt down to find the controls that would release the binders on her wrists and ankles. Leia was far too young to be locked up and strapped down like this. "Are we going home now?" she whispered, rubbing her wrists once the binders had been unfastened. Anakin didn't know if he had the heart to tell her that there was no way they could return to their old house, that they would have to move yet again. "Well, we're getting out of here, at least." He knew they would have to leave quickly, so he picked up Leia and carried her, ignoring the resulting pain. Thankfully, there was another unguarded exit out of the hallway, so Leia wouldn't have to see the carnage in the other room. She was pretty quiet as they walked along, and Anakin was able to contact R2 and arrange a meetup point. But after a few minutes, Leia buried her face in his shoulder and began to sob quietly. Anakin could count on one hand the number of times Leia had cried. If the other kids at school upset her, she would get angry and red in the face, but not cry. If she hurt herself, she would yell and scream, and if they discussed Padme and Luke, she would become quiet and somber. But she never cried like this. Anakin was hating himself more and more every minute for allowing all this to have happened. After several excruciating minutes of climbing stairs, they came to an exit where R2 had brought the ship. Anakin and Leia climbed in gratefully. R2, who was beeping joyfully at Leia, was able to lift off the ship. Anakin's adrenaline from earlier was completely gone now. As he sank into the pilot's chair, exhausted, Leia stared at his wound for a while, but she didn't say anything about it. "I'm hungry," she finally said in a soft voice. "Where are we going now?" R2 beeped in agreement. "Plus, how about we see if we can find an old friend of mine? Let's go to Shiley." It was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and everyone in the Dantooine base was asleep when the emergency alarm blasted throughout the whole building. Padme bolted out of bed, her heart pounding. Luke rolled around and mumbled in confusion as the high-pitched wail of the alarm droned on. But there was no time to wonder why the alarm had been set off, so Padme shook Luke awake and ordered him to get up and get dressed. She herself just threw on a jacket and some shoes over her nightgown, which was awkward, but there was no time to waste. They ran out of their quarters just in time to see the security team running by. Hoisting Luke up onto her back, Padme ran to catch up with them. "What's happening?" "We're under attack. We're issuing an evacuation. If you would help us spread the word." "Of course." Padme tried to keep her face composed, but her mind was reeling. How had the Empire discovered the location of the base? Would the rebels be able to escape a mass slaughter? "Mommy," Luke whispered as Padme stood and directed people to the exits. "What's evacuation?" "It's when we all leave. Don't worry, we'll be okay." Hopefully that was true. Luke's response surprised her. "Yeah, I think we'll be okay too." Strangely enough, the next half hour didn't feel like an attack. It was just logistics, moving everyone into the hangar and directing them to board the ships. C-3PO helped with this, talking to anyone who didn't speak Galactic Basic. The normally worrisome droid seemed surprisingly at ease here. Some people were sent to barricade all the entrances to the hangar, and others were put into starfighters so that they could divert the attackers and let anyone else escape. Those volunteers looked pale and grim-faced. They knew it would practically be suicide. But there was one major thing that made this whole procedure feel as abnormal and terrifying as it should. It was the sound of heavy laser blasts pounding on the roof of the building like enormous pieces of hail. The building couldn't withstand much more of this. Everyone was silent as Bale gave the final directions. They all understood that this might be the end of everything. Padme held Luke tightly, wondering if these would be her last moments with him. And yet, she only felt numb to everything. She couldn't bring herself to run around and panic, despite all that was happening. So, basically, one pilot said, "What's our strategy?" "Fight," Bale said simply. "Try to get out of here if we can. And above all, don't ever surrender." All the rebels murmured in agreement and split off into their ships. Slowly, tentatively, the main hangar door was opened. And the front line of starfighters flew straight out into the barrage of laser fire. Padme, along with Luke, Obi-Wan, 3PO and about 20 others, were all crammed into Padme's silver Naboo starship, ready to go. No one could leave until the fighter pilots could create an opening. Then, a loud cracking noise made everyone jump. A stray blast had hit a support beam, which was now starting to collapse. Padme stared at the main exit of the hangar. There was no opening yet. Blasts from the Imperials were still flying in all directions. A transmission from Mon came out through her radio. "Attention everyone. Don't wait for the opening. The building is collapsing. Get out now and use your laser cannons if you have them." Padme's passengers murmured anxiously. But she could see that Mon was right, there was no time to sit around and wait while the building collapsed. "Obi-Wan, help me lift off, would you?" "Of course," he replied, polite as ever even in the face of danger. Despite the rising level of noise, Padme and Obi-Wan remained silent as they fired up the engines and coaxed the ship into the air. Large chunks of material from the ceiling were falling everywhere. Dust rose up and clouded everyone's windshields. "Obi-Wan, I can't see, I might hit the other ships," Padme murmured, her heart pounding as she squinted through the windshield. "You won't. I can sense them move a bit to your left. That's it. Now, to the right, up a little bit." Padme followed his instructions as closely as possible. Luke's eyes followed the path they took, as if he could visualize the other ships. There was a loud rumbling crash behind them. A force from behind made the ship lurch forward, causing Padme to lose control of the ship for an instant. "What was that?" Luke exclaimed. Padme tried to look out through the rearview camera, but it was covered in dust. She glanced over at Obi-Wan, who suddenly had a pained look on his face. But there was no time to sit and wonder about this. Already some TIE fighters were whirling around them. Despite the obstructed visibility, Padme could see some green lasers flying at them. Those blasts were too close. Then there was an explosion. But it wasn't Padme's ship. A nearby X-wing had caught on fire and was now spiraling to the ground. That pilot had intercepted the blast that would have hit Padme and her passengers. "Thank you," she whispered, blinking away tears. It was the first time she had actually cried in the middle of a battle. She just didn't feel like she could bear the weight of one more death. Finally, the visibility improved as the moving air blew the dust off the windshield. Padme glanced briefly down below and saw no lights from the rebel base. There was only a dark void where the base had been. A ship was half buried in collapsed remains. A transmission from Bale came through. His voice sounded quiet and tired. "If you can make the jump to hyperspace, do it. We plan on sending the survivors to Yavin, for now." But the fleet was in disarray. Padme was busy trying to shake off some TIE fighters, and she didn't know where the other rebels were. "One, now two, ships made it to hyperspace," Obi-Wan said. "We can make it too, I think." Luke nodded in agreement. "That girl made it out okay. And my dream. Really?" Padme glanced at Obi-Wan in surprise. He shrugged, but didn't say anything. Somehow, they dodged the TIE fighters and gained enough altitude to make the jump to hyperspace. Plus, in that moment, it all finally sank in. The Dantooine base was gone for good. The first thing they experienced when arriving at Shiley was the welcoming sound of gunfire. How had they gotten to that point? Anakin had decided to land the ship far away from the major settlements, in a large field a few miles from a nearby village. And, as they flew over a small house, somebody with a rather large laser rifle fired rapidly at the ship. They were all taken by surprise as the red blasts flew by. Anakin didn't have the energy to maneuver the ship to dodge all the blasts, and Leia was too little to help much, and R2 wasn't human. They went down pretty quickly once the wing got clipped. Surprisingly enough, the landing wasn't too bad. The ship landed right side up, and it didn't hit anything. But Leia still gave a grunt of annoyance as the ship lurched to a stop. "That was a really bad landing, Daddy," she grumbled as they unstrapped themselves. "I know." Anakin made sure he had his lightsaber before stepping out of the ship. Now, Leah, we have to put our hands up as we go out there, okay? That way they know we aren't trying to fight them." Leah obeyed his instructions, but she was still muttering to herself about the landing. "I could have landed better than that." They opened the door and cautiously stepped out into the tall grass. The shooter was right there waiting for them, a tall Togruta female with a heavy laser rifle. But Anakin immediately realized there was nothing to fear. This was none other than Ahsoka Tano, his former apprentice. And she immediately recognized him too. Her stormy blue eyes widened and she dropped her gun. "Anakin. Is that you?" she exclaimed. "It's me, Ahsoka. I never thought I'd see you again." He couldn't believe this was the same spunky little teenager he had trained during the Clone Wars. Back then she had barely gone up to his shoulder, and now she was almost eye level with him. Her montrals went all the way down to her hip, and the white markings on her face had elongated and thinned out. But Ahsoka's growth was more than just physical. Her entire presence in the Force had evolved, feeling so much more wise, so much more thoughtful. And yet it still had that merry spark that Anakin remembered so vividly. Ahsoka ran up and gave him a quick hug. "I'm glad you found me, Sky Guy. I'm sorry I shot down your ship." She glanced apologetically at the smoking, blasted-off wing. "I didn't realize it was you." "Don't be sorry, Snips," Anakin said with a laugh. "That thing is a piece of junk. I would have needed an excuse to get rid of it anyway. I was gonna say you must have been pretty desperate to even tolerate flying that thing." Ahsoka's gaze moved over to R2 and Leah, and her eyes lit up. "And you still have my favorite astromech droid ever. I've missed you, little buddy." She patted R2 on the top of his dome head, and the droid squeaked in delight. Then Ahsoka knelt down next to Leah. "And who is this lovely little lady?" "That's Leah, my daughter. Mine Aunt Padms." Ahsoka grinned and gave him a knowing look. "I know. You two were never good at hiding things." "I guess not. We thought no one knew, but now it seems like everyone did." "Exactly. We just didn't say anything about it now. What happened to you and Leah anyway? You look like you tried to pick a fight with the Empire itself." Anakin and Leah exchanged a knowing glance. "Actually," Anakin said, "that's pretty much what happened. Just like you, Sky Guy, to be crazy enough to do something like that." Ahsoka shook her head in disbelief and started to climb to the top of the crashed ship. "Is the Empire hot on your trail? If they are, I'm sorry, but I would have to put you back on your junky ship and send you away. I'm not going to let them find me because of your recklessness." "Snips, I'm pretty sure they didn't see us leave, and I haven't sensed anything." "Me neither," Leah whispered. "This place feels safe. Not like Coruscant. Not like my school." Anakin was surprised that Leah was starting to recognize what the dark side felt like, but before he could say anything, Ahsoka finished searching the ship. "It looks fine. No tracking devices that I can see. We'd better go inside now. There's no reason to stand around out here." "Anakin, you look like you're going to fall over." On the outside, Ahsoka's house wasn't much to look at, but on the inside it was artistic and traditional. Painted with bright yet harmonious colors and decorated with ornate wood carvings, the place seemed to capture the essence of the whole culture of Shiley. Leah smiled as she fingered some sparkling beads that hung from a lampshade. "Pretty. This is a nice house. Thank you." Ahsoka beamed, seeming genuinely flattered by the compliment. "First things first, though. Sky Guy, you can use my bedroom. I have a med droid there." "Really? Why do you have one?" "I'm slightly paranoid." Ahsoka grinned sheepishly. "The hospital is far away from here, and I wouldn't want to go there anyway because then the government would have my information. So I have my droid just in case, conveniently enough for you." "Thanks, Snips. I really owe you one." As the droid treated him, Anakin realized he had no idea what Leah was doing. But if anyone could keep her busy and entertained for a while, Ahsoka could. It was a good feeling to just relax and know that Leah was safe and that she was in good hands. He ended up falling asleep and then waking up later than he anticipated around midnight. Ahsoka's hospitality probably didn't extend to letting him use her room all night, so he was annoyed about this. He left the room to see if Ahsoka was still up, and she was. She was sitting at her kitchen table, working furiously at a datapad, and she glanced up as he came in. "Hey. How are you doing?" "Better, thanks to you." Anakin took a seat next to her and glanced around the room. He hadn't taken much time to notice everything earlier. "Sorry, I didn't mean to sleep so long. I hope I didn't keep you waiting up." "No, it's okay, you needed the rest, and I'm rather a night owl." Ahsoka did indeed look wide awake, despite the hour. Though I think Leah was getting a little freaked out. "Is she okay?" "She's fine now. It helped when I distracted her by taking her to go out shooting. She loved that. Leah's a great shot." A wonderful kid. You're so lucky to have her. She continues to amaze me every day. I just can't believe I almost lost her." So Ahsoka glanced up from her work, her brow creased in concern. "What happened with you and her in the Empire, anyway?" Anakin told her the full story, with every detail he could think of, including the conversation with Sidious. He didn't leave out that he had succumbed to the dark side in that moment. Eventually he ended up telling Ahsoka how he and Padme got separated in the first place. Ahsoka was that sort of person who was easy to confide in. She just listened, without offering any advice or judgment. "In a way, though," she said, "Sidious is right about one thing. You need to really discover the Force for yourself." But he was a hypocrite about it. He manipulated your circumstances so that you were forced to examine the dark side and nothing else, and the Force is about so much more than that. "What do you mean?" It's kind of hard to explain this, but here's what I've learned after leaving the Jedi Order. No one can teach you the best way to connect to the Force because people connect to it differently. Obi-Wan and Yoda connect best to the purest form of the light side, and their means of accessing it is very traditional. All the meditating and peace and quiet, that's what helps them understand the Force. You and I don't quite work like that. But that doesn't mean we should pursue the dark side. There's sort of a middle ground. I don't exactly know what it is, but I've found it, and you should look for it too. A middle ground in the Force? Was there really such a thing? You've gotten so smart, Anakin said, smiling at her. Apparently, I have a lot to learn from you now. She nodded and laughed softly. Maybe you do, because there's one more thing I want to say. Surely you have some idea of what Padme is doing, you just don't realize it. If you were to guess, what would you say she's doing right now? Something political, obviously. But not the Senate. She left that once the Empire took over. And what's the only other political movement of significance these days? Something that sounds like what she would do? Maybe she's with that little rebel alliance group. They're small, but growing, and bent on fighting the Empire. Exactly. Ahsoka smiled broadly, her eyes filled with excitement. Your only problem now is that you don't know where the rebel alliance is. Fortunately for you, I do, because I helped them from afar. They're on Dantooine. I suggest you start looking for Padme and Luke there. 30 ships had departed, or tried to depart from, the Dantooine base. Only 10 made it to Yavin. They landed in a random field, far from any major city, and everyone that was left helped set up the emergency tents and get out the spare food. But it wasn't enough, it would only last 2 days at best. Obviously, the members of the Rebel Alliance needed a plan, and fast. Even Bail looked worn out and hopeless as he stood up to address everyone. Mon and Padme and I have made a decision, he said quietly. Some of us are going back to Dantooine to try to clean up and get some supplies. As for the rest of you, there's no need to sit here in the wilderness and wait for us. Feel free to take the ships into the cities and look for work. We'll contact you if anything comes up. Padme couldn't meet the eyes of the group, who murmured uneasily. So you're saying the Rebel Alliance is officially disbanded? One man exclaimed. Most of us have agreed to follow you until the end. And this is not the end. Everyone else murmured in agreement. No, we're not disbanding. We will still stay in contact, Bail reassured them. But we can't just camp out like this for very long. Mon and Padme and I will come up with a plan soon, but for now, we need to give all of you the opportunity to take care of yourselves. When Bail was done speaking, Mon and Padme approached him. Who should go back to Dantooine? Mon asked. They were all thinking the same thing, the return to Dantooine would be full of trauma and heartbreak. I'll go, Padme said with a deep breath. I need to do something productive. That's the only way I can function right now. Mon and Bail nodded gratefully. Take a team with you, Mon said. Maybe about 20 or so, to help you clean things up. What about me? Luke said abruptly, tugging on Padme's sleeve. Can I come and help? I don't think you should, Luke. The Empire might come back to make sure we're all gone, and there will be ugly things to see. Like what? Padme sighed deeply and knelt down, so she could be at eye level with him. The whole building fell down. People died in there. I can't let you see what that looks like. Stay here with General Organa and General Mothma, and be a good boy for me. She kissed him on the forehead before getting up to prepare everyone to leave, but Luke looked incensed. His round cheeks were flushed bright red. When Padme and her team were halfway to Dantooine, Luke revealed himself. He had stowed away again. And he seemed to ignore her long, passionate lecture. I had to come, was all he said. But Luke, don't you remember when I said that there are scary things there? Things you shouldn't be looking at? I know people are dead, Mommy. I felt it last night when we were all trying to get away. And I want to help the rebels that are still left. Just like you do. Of course, it was too late to bring him back to Yavin, so Padme had no choice but to give him safety instructions and let him come along. Luke was great at following instructions, but he only followed them on his own terms. The remains of the rebel base looked so much more gruesome in broad daylight than they did at night. Those steel walls had fallen flat to the ground, revealing some of the insides of the building. As all the rebels walked around, they could see smashed computers, crumpled desks, and fragments of clothes covered in ash. Everyone worked to remove the smaller remains in order to try to salvage any material they could, but almost nothing could be saved. Padme couldn't believe this was the same thing they had lived in for years. That it used to bustle with hundreds of people every day, and now it was completely empty and lifeless. There was one part of the building that was still standing, but heavily damaged. Padme found herself wandering inside and realizing that this was the area that had once been the children's playroom. Even though it was dusty inside, it was still mostly intact, with small chairs and brightly colored toys strewn all over the room. The rebels had made sure to prioritize getting the children out first, so that they all survived. But how many had lost their parents? How many children were made into orphans last night? As Padme stood alone, contemplating all this, one of her assistants came quietly up behind her. "General, I hate to interrupt you, but someone is here requesting to see you." Padme turned around and blinked in surprise at the young woman who had spoken to her. "Really? Who is it?" The girl's face was blank as she replied, "A pilot named Anakin Skywalker." Padme's heart seemed to explode inside her chest. Was it her imagination? Was she dreaming? Had she misheard the assistant? What did you say?" She stammered, feeling a sudden need to sit down. "A pilot. His name is Skywalker." "Oh, and he had a little girl with him, do you know him?" Padme didn't reply. Her head was spinning. Could Anakin really be here, with Leia? "General, are you all right? Should I tell him to leave?" "No. No." Padme sprang to her feet, her brain seemed to have regained its functionality. "Everything's fine, I just never mind. Where is he? I had him wait by the ship." All this felt like a dream. Padme felt like her legs couldn't move her fast enough to get her out of the base and back to the ship. The sun was in front of her, so as she approached the ship, all she could see at first were two silhouettes. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man, and the other was a little girl who was reaching up to hold his hand. He started to run towards Padme, and the girl tentatively followed him. The next thing Padme knew, she was in her husband's arms again. She found herself laughing and crying at the same time as he held her tightly and kissed her and whispered how much he had missed her. All those little details started to come back, the ones that Padme had forgotten over the years. The sensation of his powerful hands delicately caressing her face, the way he smiled so brightly, the way she had to stand on her tiptoes to kiss him. And yet, something was wrong. Even though his eyes shone with joy, Anakin looked strained. His face was pale and his breathing was ragged and shallow. "Something's wrong, what is it?" Padme whispered. "What do you mean?" He laughed softly. "Nothing's wrong. We're together and I couldn't be happier. No, I mean it looks to me like you're hurt and you're trying to hide it." "Oh, that? It's a long story." Then Padme felt a thick, stiff bandage around his waist. He inhaled sharply as she touched the spot, she cringed and withdrew her hand. But before he could ask him anything more, Luke came running up behind her and shouting, "Mommy." "Who's that?" Padme just smiled as Anakin knelt down to get on eye level with him. "Luke," he said, "I am your father." Luke's jaw dropped. He glanced up at Padme and exclaimed, "Really?" She nodded emphatically. "Yes, that's right." Then Luke nodded coolly and turned back to Anakin. "Then I know all about you. You like ships." Of course he likes ships. Who doesn't? Leia marched boldly up to Luke, she had been standing around and making grossed out faces up to this point. "I even get to help him fix them sometimes," she boasted. "No way." Luke's eyes widened again. Padme couldn't believe she was actually seeing this. Her two children growing up so quickly and carrying on like good friends, even though they had never really known each other. And Leia looked exactly like how Padme had imagined her to look. Dark-haired and petite, she carried herself with a sense of regality and power. She resembled her mother in physical appearance and her father in personality, whereas Luke was the other way around. As Luke and Leia ran off to play, Padme smiled and took Anakin's hand. She still couldn't believe he was really here. "Look at them, they hit it off immediately," he mused. "It's like they've always known each other." Plus, Padme nodded in agreement. "We'll never separate them again. Even if the whole galaxy rains fire on us." After 7 long years, the Skywalkers were a real family again. By the time the rebels were done cleaning up, Padme had to leave so she could fly her passengers back to Yavin 4. Anakin and Leia would go back with Ahsoka since Padme's ship was too full. Anakin didn't realize how deeply he was lost in his own thoughts, watching Padme's ship ascend into the atmosphere until Leia came up and tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, are you going to stare at the sky all day, or are we going to find Ahsoka?" He smiled at her blunt words. "You're right, we need to hurry up if we want to get to Yavin soon. Let's go find her." Ahsoka was still with her ship, sitting cross-legged on top of it and laughing and shaking her head. "Well, Sky Guy, am I good or am I good? You helped us find them. I don't know what we would do without you. Though we almost didn't find them. We were just lucky that Pad was among the few who returned to Dantooine. So?" Ahsoka climbed down from the top of her ship and looked at him pointedly. "Who cares if the other rebels are all on Yavin 4? Padme was here. She was the only one we needed to find." As the entrance ramp was lowered and they boarded the ship, Leia trailed after Ahsoka and looked up at her with big hopeful eyes. "Ahsoka, will you be going with us back to Yavin?" Ahsoka sighed and sat down in the pilot's chair. "I'll be there just to drop you off, but then I have to go. The things I do for the rebels, they're more useful when I stay on Shiley. Why, maybe your mom can tell you more about what I do once we get back to Yavin. Meanwhile, how would you like to help me lift the ship off?" Leia's eyes widened. She stared open-mouthed at Ahsoka and then glanced at Anakin as if she were asking for permission. "Can I?" she breathed. "Of course you can," Anakin said, smiling. Ahsoka helped Leia strap herself into the copilot's chair. "Leia, when your dad was a kid he could fly an Naboo starfighter all by himself. If you're anything like him, you'll do great. Just do exactly what I tell you." Leia seemed perfectly at ease as she obeyed Ahsoka's instructions on which levers to pull and which buttons to press. The ship rose smoothly into the air and she smiled proudly. "I did it," she exclaimed, raising a triumphant fist in the air. "That wasn't so hard. That's because the hard part is actually being the pilot," Ahsoka pointed out. "But you figured out the controls easily and that's great." Leia became bored after they made the jump to hyperspace, though, so she went to the back to play. Anakin waited for the ship to go quiet before asking Ahsoka, "If you don't mind my asking, what exactly is it you do for the Rebel Alliance? Why must it be remote?" She didn't respond at first. Her facial expression became suddenly neutral somber, almost. "The nature of the work itself requires me to live remotely," she said slowly, "but it's more than that. Honestly, I just have problems trusting any group of people that claims they're trying to do the right thing. You can guess why." Anakin nodded. Sad memories came to mind of Ahsoka's final struggle with the Jedi, how she had finally decided she'd had enough and just left. He had felt like such a failure that day when he realized that he wasn't enough to make her want to stay with the Jedi. He had not been able to shelter her from the hidden corruption of the Jedi Order. "My work is fulfilling," Ahsoka went on. "I travel all over the galaxy, finding new Imperial bases and planting my own surveillance devices so we can understand what the Empire's strategy is. I join the masses of common people so we can find out how they're being oppressed. I actually get my hands dirty, experiencing the real world so the rebels can better protect it. But I'd rather not let them see my face. I want to be a mystery to them so they can know me in a more objective way and not accuse me of anything false just because of some personal reason." "That makes sense," Anakin said quietly. He knew he couldn't change Ahsoka's mind, but he wished she wouldn't feel forced to live such a lonely life. "Anakin, you're the only one I would ever say any of this to. No one else knows me like you do. No one else would understand." He nodded slowly, once again trying to force back feelings of guilt for everything that had happened at the end of the Clone Wars. "Well, I'm glad you told me these things. Otherwise I would have spent the rest of my life wondering, why didn't Ahsoka ever join us at the rebel base? And now you know. Will you promise me one thing?" "Of course, what? Bring Leia back to me sometime, or Luke. Sometimes I wish my career allowed me to have a family of my own. And being around Leia has filled up that hole in my heart." Whenever Padme had imagined how Luke and Leia would behave around each other after being reunited, she had always thought they would take a while to become comfortable with each other. That they would initially have an awkward period for a few days in which they were hesitant to interact on a deep level. But Luke and Leia defied all those expectations. Just a few hours after everyone had returned to Yavin IV, the twins were already acting very much like normal siblings, complete with squabbles and fits. As Padme was walking around helping people set up tents for the night, she became aware that Luke was quietly following her. "What is it?" she asked him. His round lower lip was stuck out in a pout. "Leia's being bossy," he huffed. "How so?" "She keeps telling me how I should fly my ship." Luke indignantly held up the Model X wing they had built. Padme tried not to laugh out loud. Apparently they were having personality clashes already. Leia's strong will and sense of order versus Luke's free spirit. All she said was, "Luke, I'm kind of busy right now. Why don't you go find Daddy? He can help." "No, he's busy too. Helping people fix stuff." "Well, just try to be nice to Leia. She probably doesn't know she's being bossy. Maybe you can politely explain that you don't want to be told what to do." Luke sighed in annoyance and stomped off. This was good for him and Leia, Padme figured. They had both been used to having a parent to themselves, and now they must learn to share everything they had. It proved quite difficult over the next couple of days to manage both the rebel camp and the twins. Luke and Leia were supposed to stay with the other rebel children and do group activities for most of the day, but they would both get bored and wander off. Anakin had immersed himself into helping the rebels, so he was no more available to settle the daily disputes than Padme was. She just wanted a few hours each day to spend with her family. But with the constant flow of new supplies to manage, she hardly ever got a break. As if all this wasn't enough stress, Padme worried about Anakin and his injury. He worked himself too hard every day. She thought he should have been resting more to recover faster. But whenever she brought this up, he insisted he was fine. And Padme was so busy that she had no idea whether or not this was actually true. She was starting to reevaluate her priorities, seeing as how the Rebel Alliance was crowding out time with her family already. But she didn't get much time to think about it until she was given an opportunity to go by herself to Dantooine to investigate the cities, and she convinced Bail and Mon to let Anakin go with her. Finally, it would just be the two of them, alone together. Just like the old days. Anakin was exceptionally quiet as he lifted off the small ship they took. He didn't speak until they were in hyperspace. "This is strange, Padme. We've been back together for days, and yet I've hardly seen you at all." Padme could read a subtle undertone of confusion and hurt between his words. He probably hadn't expected to discover that she was so busy, so preoccupied. Even though she felt badly, she didn't feel that she had done something wrong. Keeping busy was how she coped with any sort of loss or hardship, and she felt that she belonged in a position of leadership like this. "I know," she said softly. "I've been living like this for years, enjoying my role within the Rebel Alliance, but also wondering if I'm giving Luke the time he deserves. And now there are two kids that need love and attention. I know I must find a compromise, somehow. Help the rebels while still taking care of Luke and Leia, and spending time with you. I miss the old days, Ani. I don't miss the war," Anakin said bluntly. "But you're right. We used to have those nights together in your apartment, at least. Now there's no peace and quiet anywhere. Part of that is because the Alliance is in a terribly awkward situation. We don't even have a base right now, so we have to work twice as hard to do anything." "Exactly, they need all the help they can get. I've heard all about this most recent battle." Padme stared sadly at the ground. She hated the feeling of all those memories coming back, the acidic reminder of all the lives lost. But Anakin was not accusing her. He put a gentle hand on her shoulder and whispered, "It's all right. This isn't your fault, and you're doing everything you can. Besides, I've failed a lot worse than you have. Recently, too." She looked up at him in surprise. There had definitely been something on his mind lately, but he had not explained what it was. "What happened?" she asked. Anakin hesitated before telling her all about the recent events involving Leia and the Empire. How she had been taken and he had spent days trying to find and rescue her. When he described how he had given into the dark side, Padme was shocked. But then again, she wasn't. Anakin had been this way his whole life. For years he had tried to suppress the part of himself that was drawn to the dark side. But it always had been there, and it always would be, and Padme had known that from the very beginning. "I think about this every day," Anakin said, staring intensely at the ground. "And I hate myself for it. What should I have done instead? Almost anything would have been better." Padme realized she had been asking herself that exact same question for several days. "You're not the only one who struggles with this," she said slowly. "I'm not so innocent either, Anakin. I, too, have gone into Empire territory and shot people down in order to protect something I care about. Maybe you were more extreme, but I still did it, and even worse, I led many others to make the same choices. But I was selfish, and you were fighting for something greater than yourself, for a cause. My cause. My ideas. That's no different than you fighting for your family." Anakin sighed and stared off into the distance for a moment before saying, "I guess." Padme hoped she had actually gotten her point across. Anakin was not the only flawed person out there. However, Padme said softly, "I do think you need to explain some of this to Leia. You told me you've never hidden anything from her, don't let this be the first exception. I know, it's just she trusts me, Padme. I don't want to lose that. I don't think you'll lose her trust because of this. But you definitely will if she finds out on her own and realizes that you never told her about it. Anakin nodded vaguely, but he seemed eager to change the subject. I think figured out what I want to do now. Someone told me that the Alliance needs a new lead pilot. No. Padme gasped, jumping up and grabbing his shoulders tightly. Please, Ani, it can't be you. Our first lead pilot was killed in the first battle. We got him a replacement for the attack the other day. He was killed too. It's dangerous. Even more dangerous than any other job here. Anakin smiled and gently brushed a stray lock of hair away from Padme's face. His gaze was intense, penetrating, seeming to stare into the depths of her soul. Padme, he whispered, that's exactly why I must do it. She opened her mouth to protest, but the controls beeped, indicating that they had come out of hyperspace. As they landed the ship, Padme tried to clear her mind so she could focus on the next task. But a new thought entered her mind, and she couldn't shake it away. Plus, she, Bail and Mon had always been willing to lay down their lives for the Rebel Alliance. But now that Anakin and Leia were back, things were getting complicated. Anakin wanted to be heavily involved with the Alliance too. There was a high chance that Luke and Leia could lose both their parents in one swift blow. If Anakin and Padme both went out to battle together, it would be far too easy to make one mistake that could end it all. The Rebel Alliance had the potential to tear this family apart, just like the Clone Wars and the Empire. And Padme had to ask herself, was the Alliance really worth that at all? Why exactly are we here again? That was not made clear to me. Needless to say, the earlier conversation had been slightly distracting. If Anakin had been told earlier why he and Padme were being sent to Dantooine, he had completely forgotten now. Padme's eyes sparkled with amusement. We're here to investigate the cities. Since the Empire discovered us to be on Dantooine, they may be trying to hold a tight grip on the cities. Harassing citizens. Searching homes. That sort of thing. And once we find that out, what can we do? She stared thoughtfully off into the distance and put on an elaborate cloak. All we can do is let the base know. Then the group must decide if we can and should help. After landing the ship, they ended up walking into the city, since it was close enough to not require use of a speeder. Anakin took Padme's hand as they walked, and she smiled up at him. He had longed for a moment like this his whole life. To be together with her, without worrying about being seen, and to know that she loved him just as much as he loved her, this was what he had spent years waiting for. Padme seemed completely absorbed in her surroundings, carefully examining every building and every person they passed by. So far, there seemed to be no stormtroopers. The city seemed to be in good condition, and the people were talking and laughing. It didn't feel like Coruscant here. Do you sense anything out of place? Padme asked. Anakin shook his head. No. Not yet, anyway. I hope the rest of the city is like this. I couldn't stand the thought of the natives being harassed because of us. This place is special to me. Why is that? Padme suddenly stopped and turned to watch as a couple of construction workers lifted a large pane of glass onto the window of a toy store, and she laughed to herself. Want to know why they're replacing that window? Sure, why? Because she lowered her voice to a whisper, Luke shattered the old one by mistake. With the Force. So Luke, as a little kid, had enough potential in the Force to shatter a window without even trying? Really? Anakin said, laughing. He must have enormous potential. Leia has never come close to doing something like that. Padme nodded and motioned for them to keep walking. Do you think Leia is Force sensitive? I can't tell easily unless it's obvious. I think she is, but not in the traditional sense. She doesn't seem interested in levitating objects or using a lightsaber. But she can feel the dark side, and she knows when something bad is about to happen before I'm even aware of it. Have you trained her at all? Considered it? I've offered it to her, but she doesn't seem to want it. I don't want to push it on her. I suppose not, Padme agreed. I really hope I've chosen the right path for Luke on getting Obi-Wan to help train him. He never exactly asked for it, but his potential is so strong, I really saw no other choice. It certainly had been surreal for Anakin to see his former mentor after all these years. It was a good thing he was available to train Luke, because Anakin wasn't sure if he was the right person to do it. How could he train an impressionable child to use the Force when he wasn't even sure that the light side was the correct thing to pursue? What is it? Padme interrupted his thoughts, probably noticing his silence. Nothing, he said. He wasn't sure if he should reveal these thoughts to Padme. She looked at him skeptically. I know that's not true. Are you upset that Obi-Wan has been the first one to train Luke? No. Quite the opposite, actually. I'm very glad that it's Obi-Wan. He has a stable, pure, trusting view of the Force, but I don't. I don't want to taint Luke with my own struggles. Anakin watched Padme's face for several minutes, trying to discern her reaction, but she only seemed to be deep in thought. Before she could say anything, a dark disturbance began to creep up in the Force. Anakin recognized it all too well. "Stormtroopers," he whispered. "What?" Padme grabbed his hand tightly. "Where?" "Far away, but they're getting closer. And someone's afraid, very afraid." "Me?" Padme said as a half-joke, smiling slightly. "No, someone's out there, afraid for their lives, just like Leia was when they took her." Anakin didn't know if he could bear to deal with stormtroopers again. His only interactions with those mindless servants of the Empire had been watching them carry Leia off into their ship and then later slaughtering them like animals. They were like the Tusken Raiders on Tatooine, wanting only to steal and kill and destroy. In that instant, a realization dawned on him. "A child?" he exclaimed. "Padme, they have a child, we have to help." Without waiting for a response, he took off running down the street. Padme sprinted to catch up with him. "Wait. You mean they're capturing a kid? We can't just go blindly running into danger." "Yes we can," Anakin said fiercely. "I am not letting them take a little kid the same way they took Leia." Despite her protests, Padme followed Anakin until they spotted two stormtroopers marching down a street full of abandoned houses. Each of them held the arm of a screaming little girl. Anakin's blood boiled at the very sight of it. The Empire had no idea what they were doing to families by kidnapping these defenseless little children, or did they? "What's the plan?" Padme whispered, cocking her blaster as they hid behind the corner of one of the houses. "First, we'll try to negotiate." Anakin smiled knowingly at her. "And if that doesn't work, then we try aggressive negotiations." Padme nodded in approval. "Good, but let me try the talking first." "Hang on. The Force might be able to help us here." Anakin stepped out from behind the building and pushed a sheet of metal onto the pavement, making it clatter noisily to the ground. The pair of stormtroopers spun to face him and drew their blasters. "Put your hands up. Civilians aren't allowed here," one of them shouted. Anakin concentrated on the Force, imagining a cloud of confusion settling in their minds. "You will release the girl and let the three of us go. What do you think you are, some kind of Jedi?" I said, "Put your hands up." Anakin leaned down and whispered to Padme, "That doesn't always work. Time to try aggressive negotiations." She nodded and drew her blaster. The stormtroopers opened fire on them, and high-pitched screeches from the blasters echoed off the old abandoned houses. In doing so, they let go of the little girl, who ran and ducked behind cover. While Padme returned the fire and kept the troopers distracted, Anakin used the Force to detach a large beam of wood from one of the houses and send it flying at their heads. It hit them both and they fell to the ground, unconscious. "Oh good," Padme breathed, replacing her blaster in its holster. "We didn't have to kill them to save the girl." Anakin wished he had been able to think that way when he was trying to rescue Leia. Maybe if Padme had been there, it wouldn't have ended so badly. He was a better person when she was around. Before he could say anything, the girl emerged from her hiding spot. Her face was red with tears, which looked a bit strange against her fair skin and bright red hair. "It's all right," Padme said gently, walking slowly up to the quivering child. "We're here to help you. Can you take us to your parents?" I don't know where they are." The girl stammered. "Well, then where's your house? Maybe they'll look for you there." 2 blocks away from the toy store. "But I don't know how to get there from here." "That's okay. We know where that is, come on." Padme took the girl's hand and they walked with her out of the alley. She started to ask the girl a few questions, but Anakin got lost in his own thoughts. What if a stranger had managed to help Leia like this? Halfway to the house, a couple walking hurriedly down the street pointed at them and started running in their direction. The little girl's eyes widened. "Mommy. Daddy," she cried, letting go of Padme's hand and running to her parents' open arms. They both embraced her tightly, with the mother crying and the father kissing his daughter on the forehead. "How did you get away from the stormtroopers?" the father exclaimed. The girl, smiling, pointed at Anakin and Padme. "That man and that lady, they saved me." The couple glanced up at Anakin and Padme in surprise, and the woman smiled broadly through her tears. "You saved our daughter? How can we ever thank you?" "Don't worry about it, it was no trouble," Padme said. Anakin nodded in agreement. "We have children of our own, so we understand what all this is like." "I can't believe the Empire would do this," the man said grimly, stroking his daughter's hair. "We've never liked them, but this is the last straw for us. It's time for us to fight back." "Out of curiosity, do you know anything about the Rebel Alliance?" Padme glanced at Anakin, eyes wide with surprise. "We do," she said carefully, turning back to the couple and their daughter. "In fact, we can take you there, if you like." Was it possible that the alliance wasn't doomed, that it could continue to grow again, even after this devastating loss? In just 3 short months, the rebel alliance was even bigger than it had been before the first battle. Everyone who had been sent to the cities on Yavin was back, and they had a small base in the woods. Not only that, but they were also making plans to expand it. It could no longer contain the massive number of new members. How had that happened? Sometimes Padme still struggled to find the answer to that question. All she knew was that it had helped to send more people into the cities to try to help families in danger. There were many high-crime areas that the Empire did not bother to control. Padme vividly recalled going into one particular slum and observing the barefoot children running across the filthy streets and the houses that were lit at night only by primitive candles because there was no electricity. The only people who had blasters were gang members who stole weapons. The law-abiding citizens were defenseless. Padme had never forgotten the pain in those people's eyes. They were used to being neglected by their own government, and a simple act of kindness from the rebels had enough power to change their lives. This was the difference between the rebels and the Empire. The Empire did not care about the poor or the oppressed. Their only goal was to create an outwardly perfect society through censorship of speech and militaristic control. Whereas the rebels sought to defend the common person and change society from the inside out. It seemed as though Padme and the other leaders of the alliance had simply figured out how to convey this message to the people, and now it was spreading like wildfire. With more members came more help, both in labor and in finances. The rebels had a base again, and now it needed expansion. Soon the rebel base on Yavin Ivy would accommodate not hundreds, but thousands of people. There was another advantage to this. Padme had been able to delegate some of her responsibilities so that she had more time to spend with her family. Part of her missed being as involved as Bail and Mon, but it was worth it. She could take care of Luke and Leia every evening and stay up late with Anakin, now that there weren't quite so many meetings and planning sessions. On one evening like this, the 4 of them were in their quarters in the Yavin base. This was a series of a couple interconnected rooms, a family-sized apartment, not like the cramped individual quarters of the Dantooine base. Anakin was showing Luke how to assemble some basic fleet formations with the toy ships, but Leia, for whatever reason, seemed to want nothing to do with it. She sat off in a corner and didn't protest when Padme took out her hairdo and began to brush her hair. Leia was lucky to have thick, shiny hair that went to her waist. Padme was thankful that no one had ever cut it. "Why don't you want to build a fleet with Daddy and Luke?" she asked, out of plain curiosity. Leia shrugged nonchalantly. "I already know those stupid simple formations. Besides, ships aren't the only thing I like." "Oh? What else do you like to do?" "I used to play dress up with my friends at school. We would pretend to be princesses. It was fun." Leia paused, staring thoughtfully off into the distance before continuing, "Except, I would always have to borrow their dresses. I only have one fancy dress. When I asked Daddy to get me more, he said they're too expensive." "They can be expensive," Padme agreed. Both she and Anakin had been forced to learn to be more conservative with money, since neither of them were paid by the government anymore. "But here's the good thing, Leia. Now that we're all together again, we have a little money to spare. How would you like it if I took you to get a new dress?" Leia turned around and stared up at her, eyes wide. "Really? Can we?" Padme felt herself smiling at Leia's enthusiasm. Finally, there was another fashion enthusiast in the family. "I think tomorrow would be perfect, after dinner." Leia threw her arms tightly around Padme. "Thank you, Mommy." It was somewhat a surprise and quite a relief to see what Leia opening up like this. Luke, being a very relaxed person, had adapted quickly to Anakin and Leia being around. But Leia hadn't accepted the change so easily. She had been polite to, but never really open to Padme or Luke. And now, that was beginning to change. Their conversation was interrupted by Padme's comlink vibrating in her pocket. Why was someone contacting her at this time of day? "Hello?" she answered, masking her irritation. "Padme, we're so sorry to bother you, but this is quite urgent," said Mon from the other end. "We think we're under attack." Padme shuddered and exchanged a meaningful glance with Anakin. "Another attack?" When the Rebel Alliance had just gotten back on its feet. How close are they?" she stammered. "The attack is in space, against our cruiser which is orbiting Dantooine. We don't think they know about this base yet. However, you already know that several of our members live aboard that cruiser. We can't afford to lose it. At least the Empire had not discovered the Yavin base yet." But there were hundreds of people aboard that cruiser, waiting for the base to expand enough to make room for them. If just one of those people were captured, there would be an immense risk that the Empire would torture that person into revealing the location of the base. It was an awful thought, both logically and emotionally. "I'll be right there," Padme said. "Anakin will come with me." After giving R2 and 3PO instructions on managing the twins and sternly telling Luke and Leia to be good for the droids, Anakin and Padme headed down to the administrative office. There really wasn't much to talk about. Bail and Mon pulled up the radar scans and video feed from nearby systems, which showed a small but powerful Imperial fleet soaring through hyperspace, heading towards Dantooine. "How much time do we have until they get there?" Anakin asked. Bail glanced at the data on the screen. "If we can leave within the half hour, we can get there at the same time they do." "We'll have to hurry," Padme mused. The others nodded in agreement. They decided that the only people going to the battle would be the pilots, and not even all of them. Reinforcements might be needed later. Padme didn't have much to do, she wasn't in charge of the fleet. Anakin was. But Padme still tried to be helpful by counting the people who were leaving and making sure they had enough supplies. Her stomach churned with dread at the very thought of Anakin leading all of those pilots straight into a battle against the Imperials. He would be the target, more so than anyone else. And yet, no one was more capable of succeeding at this mission. She watched with an anxious and heavy heart as he climbed into the cockpit of an X-Wing fighter. He seemed either oblivious or indifferent to the danger he was placing himself in, looking almost cheerful as he warmed up the controls of the powerful little ship. "Ani," she whispered, grabbing his hand to temporarily stop it from flying across the control panel. "Promise me don't die." "Not today." He smiled broadly at her and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Don't worry, Padme. I've gotten pretty good at not dying. We've faced the Imperials before and we will again, but this time, we'll win." Every other pilot in this fleet was afraid. The bone-chilling sensation in the Force that indicated another person's fear was thick and suffocating, like a slow-moving liquid that kept expanding and expanding. This sort of sensation was common right before a battle. Anakin had almost forgotten what it felt like. Some of the pilots here had survived the first two battles and understood how slim their chances were. Others had never flown in a battle before today. Their anxiety was understandable, but on the other hand, Anakin did not understand how they could feel that way. Space battles were fun, in their own way if one had a good ship. This was why he was called the hero with no fear during the Clone Wars. The general public never saw his personal life struggles, they only saw his reckless and daring stunts in space. The nickname could not have been more ironic, though. A space battle was probably the only place where he wasn't afraid of anything. Thousands of things were far worse than somebody being blown up in their own ship. His vast amount of experience in space battles gave him confidence, even though his fleet was small. But more importantly, Padme and the twins were safe on Yavin IV. Anakin did not have to worry about losing them. When the fleet came out of hyperspace and the ships formed into position behind him, his heart pounded with excitement and adrenaline rushed through his veins. The fun part was just about to begin. For a few peaceful seconds, it was just them and the rebel cruiser hovering over the green sphere of Dantooine. But the Imperial fleet appeared out of hyperspace before anyone could say a word. TIE fighters poured out of a massive Imperial Star Destroyer, screeching and roaring like wild animals. The rebel cruiser put up a laser shield around itself as the TIE fighters opened fire on it. "Red Squadron, split up and pursue those smaller fighters," Anakin said over the comm. "Gold, get behind me. We're going after the Star Destroyer." The response online was a mix of affirmative replies and anxious mumbling. Going up against the Star Destroyer might cost people their lives, but they had to do it early, otherwise the rebels would have no chance. "Get into attack position," Anakin said to the fleet. The clunking of machinery sounded as the X-Wings unfolded into their attack position. Then, the red group and the gold group split off. The gold fighters followed Anakin up towards the Star Destroyer, which then began to open fire on them. "Return fire. Aim for the small revolving cannons." Anakin dodged the green blasts one at a time, the Force guiding his movements and helping him anticipate the blast's timing. Some people felt like a space battle was madness and randomness, but really it was more like a dance. If a pilot just knew what to expect, the blast patterns and ship movements could seem predictable and orderly. From there, Anakin completely lost track of time. It was a good feeling, not having to focus on anything except avoiding laser fire, shooting the revolving gun turrets, and occasionally looking around to make sure the other pilots were doing okay. Thanks to the combined effort from the Gold Squadron, they took down 3 of the revolving cannons in a matter of minutes. One or two TIE fighters were crashing to the surface of Dantooine, thanks to the Red Squadron. The Imperials had not even been able to touch the rebel cruiser so far. But their rapid progress could not last forever. The Imperials seemed to realize what they were up against, and they dispatched another group of TIE fighters, which then went and surrounded some of the Red fighters. One X-wing burst into flames and spiraled out into space as a TIE fighter shot it. Everyone could hear the pilot's screams over the comm. The Force suddenly felt cold and sobering, like a splash of icy water to the face. "Wake up," Anakin thought to himself. "I can't afford to lose these pilots." Aloud he said, "I'm signaling the base to send us some reinforcements. Until then, maybe 3 gold pilots should go out and help Red." As time went on, his worry about the Red Squadron increased, and he kept sending more and more gold fighters out to help them. Soon he was left with only 2 other pilots to help with the Star Destroyer, but they had taken down most of the revolving gun turrets. Then, the real challenge proved to be keeping all the TIE fighters at bay. They were spreading out, seeming to be everywhere, randomly appearing from the front or back, or top or bottom, of people's ships. The reinforcements from Yavin couldn't get there fast enough. In the midst of all this, the rebels made one major blunder. Anakin and another gold pilot were flying in front of the Star Destroyer when a sudden disturbance in the Force came up. The large frontal laser cannons of the Star Destroyer were heating up rapidly. The Imperials had been saving these till the last minute, withholding them so that the rebels would forget about them. An enormous blast about the size of a cockpit flew at them. More specifically, the blast was aimed at the other pilot. Anakin, reacting instinctively and not strategically, tilted his ship so that his wing, instead of the other ship, would intercept the blast. His X-wing jolted violently as its wing was turned into ash and smoke. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Anakin thought angrily to himself as his ship spiraled dizzyingly towards the surface of Dantooine. That was the oldest trick in the book, and the rebels had fallen for it. For the 3rd time in the last couple of months, Anakin had to attempt to land his out-of-control ship safely. With the one wing completely gone, that would not be possible, so he forced the cockpit open and jumped to the ground just before the ship crashed. Dust and debris flew everywhere, and the ground shook underneath the sudden weight of the ship. It would not be possible to fix it easily. In addition to the wing being gone, the ship body was crumpled and distorted beyond repair. Anakin was stuck on the ground, while his fleet had to fend for itself. But there was one advantage. It was night on this side of the planet, far from any city, and the sky was clear. The battle was still visible from this vantage point. It looked almost beautiful from here, with the red and green lights flickering like fireworks. Anakin had almost forgotten about his comlink, which was still connected to the group channel and buzzing with activity. "Gold leader crashed," someone was saying. "He's not responding, he's probably dead." No, I'm not dead," Anakin said into the comm. "I'm okay, just stuck on the ground." His voice trailed off when he saw something. The eerie red glow of a Sith's lightsaber, accompanied by an all-too-familiar sinister laugh. Luke and Leia were stuck in the single most boring place in the galaxy, and they knew it. R2 and 3PO came up with some random games in a lame attempt to keep the twins occupied, but the latter could not be fooled. Leia, especially, understood that they were missing out on the real action. 3PO, can we at least find mommy and see if we can watch the space battle with the grown-ups? Luke whined, staring dully at the pile of cards the droids had put out. We wouldn't be causing any trouble, especially if we're really quiet. I'm sorry, Master Luke, 3PO chirped. The 4 of us have strict orders to remain here and not leave the premises. Leia rolled her eyes visibly. 3PO, I think you're miscalculating. We're not on the sea, and I don't even know if the premises is a real thing. No, Mistress Leia, premises. PREM, but before the protocol droid could complete his enrichment of Leia's vocabulary, a crashing noise outside made them all jump. The twins finally seemed interested in what was going on. What was that? Leia exclaimed. While there is no way we can be absolutely certain, I estimate a 95% chance that it was a massive object orbiting the planet. R2 interrupted 3PO with a sequence of harsh beeps. Leia blushed bright red when she understood a couple of his words. Luke didn't know any astromech language or any curse words in general, so his face remained blank and confused. R2? You mustn't speak that way in front of the children. What would Mistress Padme say? The droids continued to bicker. R2's beeps were too fast and complex for Leia to understand, and 3PO was too busy arguing to translate, so eventually, Leia took it into her own hands to interrupt them. Would you guys please tell me and Luke what's going on? Nothing, 3PO said in a rather suspicious voice. R2, I don't know what sort of misadventures you may have had with Master Anakin, but they must have messed with your circuits, because that is the most absurd idea. What? What is? Luke demanded. With a few more beeps from R2, Leia gasped as she realized something. He's trying to say he thinks someone is outside. Everyone shut up and listen. The room fell silent. Everyone could hear a soft pounding on the emergency door, coming from the outside of the base. Someone's trying to come in, Luke whispered. Now what? R2 gave a complex series of beeps, and 3PO hesitated before translating. Tell us what he said, don't hide it. Leia hissed. He recommends setting up a tripwire by the door, unlocking it, and letting the intruder in. Then, he would shock the intruder and we could bind him. Personally, I am against it, it is far too risky. Well, I'm for it, Leia said. Daddy always does risky things, and they usually work. We'll be okay. Yeah, let's do it. Luke agreed. As R2 and the twins quietly worked to set up the tripwire, 3PO just paced anxiously around and moaned about how he ought to have a word with Master Anakin and his questionable parenting skills. In less than a minute, the tripwire was set, R2 was in position, and even 3PO was quiet. Then Luke used the Force to nudge the door open, and a figure covered in black armor burst in, wearing the dark helmet of an Imperial TIE fighter pilot. As R2 predicted, the tripwire sent him sprawling to the floor, and a quick electrical shock made his body go limp. Yes? Luke exclaimed, helping Leia and R2 put their prisoner in laser binders on his wrists and ankles so that he wouldn't go anywhere. Leia yanked off his helmet to reveal the face of a dazed-looking teenage boy. Ha! Look at the stupid look on his face. She said, grinning. Now what? Do we tell mommy? Luke said. No. Leia snapped. She's busy. Master Luke, why don't you close the door? 3PO suggested. Yeah, and not with the Force or something. Leia glanced warily back at the prisoner, knowing that people did not take kindly to seeing someone use the Force, and she gasped when she saw that the prisoner looked more lucid already. We all know that the Force isn't real, kid, he said dully. Leia scowled, trying to think of a good retort, when a loud thump sounded and Luke burst into tears. She ran up to him, concerned. Luke, are you okay? No, I tripped on the wire. Luke wailed, picking himself up from the floor and running towards 3PO, who would undoubtedly be sympathetic. Leia huffed in annoyance. Oh, don't be such a crybaby. Daddy got his whole arm cut off, and he's fine now. And then wait a second. The prisoner interrupted. The metal arm, the blue astromech, it all makes sense. I know your dad, he's the jerk who almost didn't take me to Coruscant. Luke's face went pale, while Leia's flushed bright red. He's not a jerk. She yelled, marching defiantly up to the captive. You're the jerk. Especially if you like Coruscant and the Empire. R2, get this laser brain to shut up, will you? With one more zap from R2's shocking device, the prisoner once again fell unconscious. All was silent except for 3PO quietly muttering, oh, dear. How did an Imperial pilot get here, anyway? Luke said, half to himself. No idea, Leia whispered. We'll find out soon, though. I'm just mad that we probably caught the most annoying guy in the galaxy. Padme didn't know if she could stand to listen to the pilot's comm channel for another moment. Her head was spinning, she felt too light, and her heart was racing unnaturally fast. She found it necessary to lean on the control panel to stay standing. Anakin's ship had just crashed. Gold Leader? One of the pilots said. There was no response except for the crackling of white noise. Gold Leader, do you copy? Please, Ani, Padme whispered. The knot in her stomach tightened when the silence persisted. He's not responding, someone else said online. He's probably dead. Cold shock gripped Padme's heart like ice. The twins would be devastated. They were far too young to go through something like this. Anakin should have never been the lead pilot, it was too dangerous, and everyone knew that. No, I'm okay, just stuck on the ground. Anakin's voice was a surprising relief to everyone who had been listening. But Padme did not feel at ease yet, because sounds of scuffle came through the other end, including a sinister laugh and a lightsaber activating. Then Anakin's end of the line was cut off, and the other pilots continued to chatter. Padme glanced up to see that her friends were staring at her in concern. Her inner turmoil must have shown on her face. But she didn't want to be pitied. She wanted to help Anakin, if that was at all possible. She could be of no use against a lightsaber-wielding opponent, but there was something else she could do. We have to take down that Star Destroyer, she announced. Padme, I understand your concern, but we already sent out the reinforcements, Mon said. We have to let them do their job. I know, but they're pilots. Their job will probably involve defending our cruiser and shooting TIE fighters. They might not have time to actually take down the Star Destroyer. No, I'm suggesting we fly up a stealth team to destroy it from the inside. I want to lead that team." Bale sighed and shook his head. "I think we've already done all we can and all we should. Why waste the resources when we already have pilots out there working on it?" Padme studied his face. His eyes looked dull and tired, and his usual passion was gone. He was afraid of another failure. But his proposed solution was wrong. So far, this battle was being treated exactly like the first and second. "This is the problem," she said. "If we have the resources, we should use them. Otherwise, we'll surely lose all the pilots in the cruiser. Please, there's no time to argue about this. I will go alone if I have to." "No, you won't go alone." Mon stood up and looked pointedly at Bale and some of the others. "I'm not going to just sit here either. There is a risk associated with this course of action, but if enough people go with us, that risk is reduced, and our chance of saving the cruiser is much higher." Maybe this was a foolish idea and it would fail miserably, but other people seemed to be catching on. Everyone in the room was thinking the same thing. Maybe the problem with the last two battles was simply that the rebels had hesitated to throw everything they had at the Empire. As a ship was prepared to transport the stealth team up, Padme hurried towards the living quarters. 3PO was supposed to bring the twins to her so she could tell them what was going on. They chattered excitedly at her, clearly wound up about something, but she had to interrupt them for time's sake. "I'd love to hear more about it later, but please listen to me for a moment. I'm going up with General Mothma to take a stealth team to go blow up the Imperial cruiser. I might be gone for a little while." Luke's and Leia's eyes widened. "Wow!" Luke exclaimed. "I wish we were old enough to go with you and help. Someday, you'll both be old enough to fight the Empire. And you'll be great at it." Padme smiled, trying not to think about all the ways the mission could go wrong, and she embraced both of her children and kissed them on their foreheads. "Depending on how things go, Daddy might get back here first. He's stuck on Dantooine right now, so he has to figure out how to get back." "Did the Imperials shoot him down?" Leia asked. "Yes, but he's okay for now. We'll tell you all about it later, but I've got to go. Be good for the droids. Your dad and I will be back soon, I promise." Strangely enough, Padme didn't feel nervous until the hangar of the Imperial cruiser came into clear view. The whole stealth team held their breath as the radar technician sent an electronic signal to the Star Destroyer, which would disable their scanners and create a temporary diversion. A red strobe light flashed, indicating a security breach. People flooded into the hangar, with their shadows flickering on and off the wall. The strobe light made all the motion look choppy. Padme, Mon and the three other stealth team members ran out of the ship immediately so that they blended in with the swarm of people. Where was the easiest place to hide? In a crowd. Obi-Wan had taught Padme that much. So far, this plan was working well. The next step was to break into a small computer lab, render the occupants unconscious, and steal their uniforms. "Remember," Mon said to the others as they walked quickly through a maze of hallways, "hide your faces from the cameras so that we won't be seen. It's risky to shoot the cameras because that can draw attention." Their holomaps beeped softly, indicating that they had arrived at the computer lab. The doors were partially open. The room was silent, except for the clicks of typing on keyboards. One of the stealth team members held a spherical gas grenade in his hand and rolled it into the room. The metal grenade made a tapping noise as it hit the cold, hard floor. Padme cringed, knowing how quiet that computer lab was and that surely someone would notice. But no one did. The grenade rolled to a stop and automatically twisted itself open, releasing a brown gas throughout the room. Only then did the people inside notice there was a problem. But the military-grade gas was fast-acting, so all the Imperial computer scientists collapsed within seconds. As they waited for the gas to clear, Padme whispered to the team, "We'll definitely shoot the cameras in there. That will help us more than it will harm us. Then grab a uniform and get out of there quickly." The uniform she picked up was far too large for her petite frame, but there was no time to fuss with it. To the entire team's surprise, even though they passed by several other groups of Imperial officers, no one took any notice of them. No stormtrooper squad came after them. It felt strange to be walking so openly in Imperial territory. Upon arriving at the engine room, they all tried to insert their stolen badges into the security machine, but it rejected all of theirs, except for the radar technicians. "Good luck," Mon said to him, handing him a decoding device which could obtain passwords. "Keep your comlink on and let us know if something comes up." From there, all they could do was wait. Padme tried not to be disappointed that she, Mon and the two others could not help the radar technician. She couldn't control whether or not the person to whom her uniform belonged had access to the engine room. Minutes passed by. The radar technician didn't say much over the comm. He only grunted and muttered softly to himself as he worked with the engine machinery. The rest of the team listened as a couple of loud clicks and rapid beeps sounded. There was no easy way to hack into it, he finally said, but I planted some grenades. I have 30 seconds to get out of here. I'm on my way out. He soon burst out of the door, gasping for breath, and everyone took off running away from the doomed engine room. Even when they were far away from the engine room, the floor and walls shook violently from the impact, sending them sprawling to the floor. Alarms started to flash and people were running in all directions, trying to evacuate. It soon became a shoving match just to get anywhere. By the time they managed to get to the hangar, the door was closing. Many Imperials made it through, but the disguised rebels did not. We need to find the escape pods. Mon shouted over the noise. Padme and the others nodded and ran after her. It seemed as though they would be joining Anakin on Dantooine after all. The ship was finally starting to feel like it was losing altitude. The floor was tilting slowly downwards. Padme felt that she was slipping more than she was running. I have to get out of here alive, was her only thought. My children need me. Finally, they came to the escape pods and all climbed inside one. There they are. The rebels. A stormtrooper voice made them all jump. Before the escape pod door could close fully, the shrieks of laser fire pierced the air. Something hot and forceful hit Padme just under the chest. A laser blast. Her body went numb. She struggled to breathe, her lungs seemed locked. The noise and chaos swirled vaguely around her. It was only after the escape pod door closed and the window showed Dantooine growing bigger and bigger when Padme had an odd realization. She was not in much pain. Mon was shaking her vigorously, saying her name over and over again. Padme suddenly remembered something and laughed softly to herself. I'm all right. See, she pulled off the Imperial uniform and the blouse she wore underneath it. I'm wearing blast protection. It seems to have taken most of the damage. And it wasn't an ugly, ill-fitting blast-proof vest. It was the blast-proof corset she used to wear during her Senate days. With the constant assassination attempts and public appearances, Padme had needed a way to protect herself and still look good. And, years later, the special corset was coming in handy again. It acted as armor, Mon said, exhaling in relief. You're lucky you decided to wear it today. Everyone in the pod watched in satisfaction as the Star Destroyer continued to fall, slowly but surely. The Imperial fleet seemed to be in disarray, with the TIE fighters buzzing randomly around like bees without a beehive. We did it, the radar technician murmured. It's going down in flames, Padme said. And hopefully, the Empire along with it. The forest was pitch black, except for the red glow of a Sith's lightsaber. The air was silent, except for that sinister chuckle, and the Force was still except for the unforgettable presence of Darth Sidious. I'm dead for sure this time, Anakin realized. What else could Sidious possibly want? Surely he had given up hope of convincing Anakin to become his apprentice. Sidious had left him alive last time, and quite on purpose. He probably wouldn't be so merciful again. There would be no running away from this. If Sidious had found him already, trying to hide would only delay the inevitable. The red light from his lightsaber was just enough to reveal his grim smirk from underneath his hood. I have one question for you, Anakin. What have you accomplished since I last saw you? Oh, I already know the answer. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. My accomplishments are none of your business, Anakin retorted, reaching for his lightsaber. Sidious went on as if he hadn't heard him. You have done nothing but run. Run from your true self. Tried to hide who you really are because you fear the dark side. And now you are little more than an empty shell who is incapable of saving your wife and children and your pathetic rebel fleet and yourself. Anakin barely had time to activate his lightsaber before Sidious lunged at him, and their fight began. Just like last time, Sidious's strokes were fast and complex and difficult to keep up with. It almost felt like there were 4 Sith in his place instead of 1. First he appeared in front of Anakin, then behind him, then to his left, all within milliseconds. Was this as powerful as the Emperor got? Or was he holding himself back? Maybe, Anakin thought, the dark side can help me here. But which was worse? To die and abandon his family, or to live only through the power of the dark side? That decision would have to be made quickly. He could not keep this up forever. And using the dark side would be so easy. The passion and energy required to activate it was right there, bottled up and ready to release. Anakin vividly recalled the raw power of the dark side, the adrenaline rush, the mental clarity. Last time, it had saved his life and enabled him to save Leia when he had been so close to death. One thing was certain. The dark side really worked. Just thinking about it was pushing him over the edge. The dark side was taking over his mind once again. Maybe it would be futile to resist. As the fight went on, an image came to his mind. One of Ahsoka in her home on Shiley, surrounded by her brightly colored walls and dim lamps and shimmering jewelry. "There is a middle ground in the Force," she said. But what did that mean? Surely there were only two sides of the Force. The light, which was weak, and the dark, which was evil. No, there had to be a third option. Both the Jedi and the Sith were wrong. What if the light side and the dark side were meant to work together? As Sidious came down with a particularly heavy lightsaber stroke, Anakin became aware of a whole new dimension of the Force. One of the light side and dark side existing together, not separately. Allowing both sides to mix felt energizing, but stable. The dark side gave him the strength to block Sidious's powerful blow, and the light side kept his movements grounded and precise. From there, the fight went in a completely different direction. Sidious was no longer gaining ground. Anakin was on the offense. The Emperor's moves were no longer so hard to predict. If he randomly appeared somewhere, Anakin was already there, ready with an offensive stroke. Sidious's face hardened, maybe with concentration or anger or something else entirely. Anakin didn't dare entertain the notion that he actually had the upper hand against this powerful Sith. It seemed far too good to be true. They continued like this for a long time, at least twice as long as they had in the last duel. Sidious was not wearing out, but neither was Anakin. A bright light flashed in the sky, so bright that it looked like a flare that was sent up nearby. But actually, it was the Imperial Star Destroyer, suddenly going up in flames. They did it, Anakin thought. The rebels just won their first battle. "We shall have a very interesting discussion about this," Sidious said through clenched teeth. "But not today." As he spoke, he produced a surge in the Force which sent Anakin flying backwards into the side of a cliff. He barely noticed the impact. All he knew was that by the time he got back up, Sidious was gone. But there was no time to think about this. A couple of small, blinking red lights in the sky grew bigger and bigger, and the humming of a quiet motor indicated that this falling object was an escape pod. Not only that, but there was also a new presence in the Force, that of Padme, Mon Mothma, and maybe a couple of other people. After a few seconds, the dark silhouette disappeared behind the tree line, where the sun was just starting to come up. Anakin realized with horror that Sidious was still lurking about. What if he had left because he had also sensed Padme and Mon and wanted to kill them? And he had the head start. Anakin took off running as fast as he could, his heart pounding with dread. The forest was dark and full of tree roots and tall weeds. Only through the Force was it possible to navigate efficiently. Anakin felt like he was going nowhere, heading in circles around a never-ending path. But the presences in the Force kept growing clearer. By the time he stumbled into the clearing where the escape pod had landed, he found Padme and the others chatting lightly as they gathered supplies. Sidious was nowhere to be seen. Surely he would have gotten here first. Where, then, had he gone? And what was he after? Anakin was so startled to find this peaceful scene where he had expected a horrendous one that he jumped when Padme spoke to him. "Oh, what good timing," she exclaimed. "We were just about to go looking for you." He smiled uneasily as he approached the group. "I'm glad it was me that found you first, and not the Emperor. He's around here somewhere." "Emperor Palpatine? Here?" Mon said incredulously. "He attacked me after I landed. For some reason, he fled in the middle of the fight. I assumed he was going after you." Sidious's presence was gone by now, but that didn't set Anakin's mind at ease. After all, the whole Jedi Council hadn't been able to sense that the seemingly benevolent Chancellor Palpatine was actually the infamous Sith Lord they had been looking for. "If he's around, we'd best get out of here quickly," Padme pointed out. "I'm guessing your ship isn't flyable, Anakin?" "No, it's beyond repair. We should arrange a rendezvous with someone from our cruiser." He had barely finished speaking when some of the other rebels pulled out a comlink and got online with one of the other pilots. They managed to arrange a meetup point a few miles away. That wouldn't be nearly as bad for walking in the desert at midday for an hour. As they waited, the Force remained calm and stable. Could that mean that Sidious was gone? That all this was finally over? Getting back to Yavin Ivy proved to be rather hectic, with all the travel logistics that had to be done. A gunship took them to the cruiser they had just saved, and from there they had to find a shuttle to take back to the Yavin system. Padme barely had time to talk to anyone, much less process her own thoughts, until they got back. The base was asleep by the time Padme was walking down the hallway with Anakin on their way back to their apartment. Finally, the majority of the rebels sent out on a mission had come back alive. The only tragedy was that a few had fallen, instead of having most fallen and all failed. Padme had nearly forgotten what winning a battle actually felt like. It was as though a massive weight was lifted off her back. She felt light, giddy, finally able to think. "I can't believe we won," she mused, half to herself. The plan worked, sending all the reinforcements we had. We all thought it would take so much more than what we had to fight off the Imperial fleet, but what we had worked. Anakin nodded in agreement. The rebels have spirit and determination. The Imperials are just following orders. That's the difference between us and them. He paused and stared off into the distance before looking Padme straight in the eye. "You should be proud, Padme. If we win this battle, it will be easier to win others. All this, so much of this is your doing." She felt herself flushing at his words. The Rebel Alliance had always been like a child to her, but she had never expected it to grow up and make her proud so quickly. In response, all she could think to say was, "That's sweet of you, Ani." "It's true," he coolly replied. "I guess all we have to worry about now is the Emperor. Oh, we'll always worry about him as long as he has his empire. But I don't think he's an immediate threat right now." "You know what I think?" "What?" Anakin's face was still tense and anxious. The Emperor was still clearly at the front of his mind. He left because he needed to salvage his fleet. And he couldn't keep up with you forever. Anakin shook his head and laughed softly. "Me, a match for him? Impossible. Maybe he just underestimated you. And, up until now, you have underestimated yourself." Then, they arrived at their apartment door, and Padme cringed when she heard the noise coming from inside. "Apparently the droids didn't manage to put the kids to bed," she whispered, opening the door. Luke and Leia, upon hearing the door open, came racing up with their faces flushed and their eyes sparkling. "Mommy, Daddy!" Luke shrieked. "Come in quick, we have something to show you." "Yeah," Leia said. "We tried to tell you earlier, Mommy, but you weren't listening." "Well, keep your voices down, our neighbors are asleep," Padme scolded them, following them into the living room. What she saw made her gasp. A teenage boy bound and gagged in the living room corner. But before Padme could say anything, Anakin spoke angrily to the boy. "Han Solo. I was hoping I wouldn't have the displeasure of seeing you again. What in the galaxy are you doing here?" Leia pulled the gag off Han's mouth so he could speak. "I was really hoping to not see your lousy face again either," he said dully. "But I actually didn't mean to come here. My navigating computer malfunctioned and I crash-landed here. Then your insane kids and their droids tied me up like this." "He's a scumbag, Mommy," Luke explained, observing the bewildered look on Padme's face. Leia nodded in agreement. "He's an Imperial pilot, that's why we can't let him go." "Oh, dear," Padme sighed. What a mess this was, having a lost Imperial pilot accidentally showing up here and now knowing where the base was. "Here's what we're going to do," Anakin announced. "Lock him up in a jail cell until the Empire falls or he converts to our side." Padme winced at the thought. Those jail cells were inhumane in her view. And this young man had arrived by accident. He seemed misguided, but not malicious. "No, that will be unnecessary," she said. "I'll take him to the security office and we'll have him get a job here. There's so much work to be done around here, I'm sure he'll never be bored." For the next couple of days, Leia seemed to be obsessed with hovering over Han as he worked as a mechanic, teasing and taunting him until he snapped at her, and she always came back angry and red-faced. Anakin did not understand why she was doing this to herself. Was it out of desire to have someone to make fun of? That couldn't be healthy. "That prisoner guy is so annoying," Leia grumbled one day, sitting next to Anakin and playing with his mechanical hand as he did some work on a data pad. "He keeps calling me little princess. In a mean sort of way. I'm not little." "Well, he's bigger than you are, so he's going to tease you for being smaller than himself. But you and all the other grown-ups are bigger than me, and you don't call me little. That's because we know you don't like it." "He probably doesn't know." Leia shook her head defiantly. "Oh, he knows. He just likes to annoy me." "If he annoys you so much, why do you like to hang around him?" Anakin looked at her pointedly. She scowled to herself and did not reply. The silence dragged on for minutes as Leia got lost in her own thoughts and Anakin resumed his work. But he couldn't get that nagging feeling to go away, the one that urged him that this was the perfect time to tell Leia the full story of what happened at Coruscant. "Leia," he said slowly, "do you remember when the stormtroopers took you away?" She nodded quietly. It was the first time they had really discussed this since the event. "When I rescued you, I think there's something you should know. Remember how we talked about the dark side? It was everywhere on Coruscant," Leia said softly. "That's right. And in order to find you, I had to fight a Sith first, and he made it so that it seemed like using the dark side, all by itself, was the only way to save you. So, I saved you, but I did some bad things along the way." He watched her face carefully. There was no surprise or shock on her face, only a quiet sort of sadness. After a long moment, she spoke. "I'm just glad I'm here with you and Mommy and Luke. I know that bad stuff happened, but we're okay now. Maybe the dark side can be useful sometimes." Obi-Wan would have corrected Leia immediately for saying something like that, but Anakin realized that this was what he had discovered in his most recent fight with Sidious. This was what Ahsoka had been trying to tell him. The light side and the dark side combined into one powerful element called the Force. Was this the truth he had been searching for his whole life? A few days after the battle, the rebel base had returned to normal. Padme woke up early one morning to find Anakin and Luke having a conversation in the living room. Anakin was on his knees to be at eye level with Luke, holding out his lightsaber to the wide-eyed little boy. "Seriously? It's mine now?" Luke gasped, gently fingering the lightsaber as if it might randomly disappear. Anakin smiled broadly and nodded. "It's all yours, Luke. I hear that you have to keep borrowing Obi-Wan's for your lessons, so I think it's about time you got one of your own." Luke accepted the lightsaber and stared at it in awe. "Wow, thanks Daddy. I can't wait to show everyone at school." "Well, I would only show it to one, or maybe two, people that you really trust. A lightsaber is a powerful thing. It can make you into a monster if you're not careful, or it can help you save your life. Either way, you shouldn't run around and brag about it. Does that make sense?" "Yeah," Luke shrugged and stared off into the distance. "I guess I wouldn't like it if somebody else got a lightsaber and started waving it around in my face." Padme smiled to herself as she watched all this. She hadn't been able to watch Luke in his first lightsaber session with Obi-Wan, but this came pretty close. Luke noticed her standing in the doorway and came running up, holding the lightsaber in the air. "Mommy, look, do you see? I have my own lightsaber now." "Yes, Luke, that's wonderful." Padme handed him his lunchbox and gave him a quick kiss on the forehead. "Just be careful with it, okay? Listen to any instructions from your father and Obi-Wan." "I will." Luke hurriedly put the lightsaber in his backpack and ran towards the door. "I've got to catch up with Leia, she has the head start. Bye." As the door shut behind him, Padme turned to Anakin, who was smiling more brightly than he had in years. She reached up and put a hand on his shoulder. "Luke will treasure that his whole life," she said softly. Anakin nodded, deep in thought. "I hope so. I certainly won't be needing it anymore." "Why, what was wrong with it? It just doesn't really suit me now." The blue blade represents a Jedi Guardian, solely devoted to the light side. "The style of my new lightsaber shouldn't favor one side of the Force over the other, it should have a silver blade." Padme had never heard of an approach like this, of eliminating the concept of the light side and dark side, and she wasn't sure how she felt about it. But Anakin seemed, for once, truly at ease. For no explicable reason, Padme felt tears welling up in her eyes. Anakin noticed and took her gently in his arms. "What's the matter?" he whispered. "Nothing. Look how far we've come. For the first time, I think, I'm confident in the Rebel Alliance, and I'm not worried about you. And I'm not so worried about you and the twins now. Padme, I think this might be what it feels like to be free. Really free." Before Padme could say another word, Anakin leaned down and kissed her, and when she closed her eyes, the world around them faded away into blissful silence. It was one of those rare moments where the entire galaxy, war-torn as it was, seemed to be at peace even if only for an instant.